All right, you may be looking at your screen and wondering, wow, there are 4 wonderful women here. Why? Who is doing this to us? Just kidding. We are joined by Rachel Bovard of the Conservative Partnership Institute and Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum. We have a huge panel that we are going to get into. I think there might be some fighting. We'll see. But before we do, we want to make sure we mention this amazing special. I know you guys have heard this, but BP Free 1. That's the promo code for this 30-day free trial that is happening right now at breakingpoint.com. We got an amazing flood of subscribers after yesterday's show. You get the whole show together, packaged nicely in your inbox in the morning. It's a great way to start the day. Of course, I'm biased, but I love watching Krystal and Sagar all put together perfectly as a premium subscriber myself. So BP Free 1. If you just want to try it out, see what it's like, you can go to breakingpoints.com, log in. Huge news cycle, huge few months ahead of us with the election and then what happens after the election. So we will be there for all of that, and you can try it free at BP Free 1 promo code at breakingpoints.com. All right, so we are again joined by the lovely Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum and the lovely Rachel Bovard of the Conservative Partnership Institute, both on the right. And we are going to get into some big topics. Obviously, cat ladies. We couldn't have these two on without talking about cat ladies. We'll get into that. We want to start, though. We can put E2 up on the screen. Kamala Harris is on a swing state tour. She's looking at potential vice presidential candidates from Tim Walz to Josh Shapiro. I kind of feel like Shapiro has the lead on this. We're going to get into a lot of like social issue questions later with the panel, but let's just start. I want to toss this to you, Rachel, with Kamala Harris trying to put together the Obama coalition in some of these states where she said things like straight up, she wants to ban fracking. That's going to be all over the airwaves in Pennsylvania from now until Election Day, as we said earlier in the show. So is there anything she can do? Is there any vice presidential candidate that could really be an advantage, give her an advantage in some of those states? I know you've worked on actually how the right can start to, both of you, and Inez and Rachel have both worked on how the right can start to make a sustainable coalition out of the gains it made with the Obama coalition. So what do you make of how Harris could potentially do that?
I think you're probably right that Josh Shapiro, I think, balances the ticket in that regard. I think he seems a little bit more moderate. He talks, I think, more to the moderate faction of the Democratic Party. But I also think that you have, I wouldn't sleep on someone like Mark Kelly, who I think has made his career in that sort of moderate vein. He also has a lot of political architecture behind him, right? He and his wife have built a pretty massive fundraising and policy advocacy group on gun control. He brings that to the ticket. I also think he speaks, well to these voters. He can balance Kamala Harris's progressivism a little bit, by swinging to the middle. He's made his whole career that way. He's like the least inoffensive Democrat in the Senate, and I think that's by design. So I think he brings that. And then you have people, reportedly she's also considering people like Andy Beshear, who's governor of Kentucky, who I think has proven his political mettle by surviving in that state and moderating where necessary. But he's interesting to me watching him sort of take on the J.D. Vance hillbilly-esque persona, saying things like, oh, well, he ain't from here. You have a little bit of an authenticity issue, I think, with Beshear that rivals that of Kamala Harris. When you think about the fact that, yes, Andy Beshear, you are from Kentucky, but not everyone can have their first job out of law school be handed to him from his daddy's law firm. So I do think there's, a little bit of a try-hard element there. But, she's got, I think, some interesting picks. And I think what's going to be challenging is when Obama was president, you had very much of a different dynamic now than I think you have in the Democratic Party today, which is you have a progressivism ascendant to some extent. There's a definitely, Joe Biden has shown that. And I think wedding those two, those sort of moderate faction and the progressive wing is going to be more difficult now than it was for Obama. And I don't know that you blend them as easily, frankly.
I mean, what we're seeing in the polls right now is, by the way, I want to say for the record, this panel was my idea. I wanted to be outnumbered ideologically overwhelmingly today, apparently for some reason, but it's always lovely to see you vote. At least what the polling is showing now, Democrats are so freaking happy it's not Joe Biden that everyone is more or less unified. I mean, that's why you've seen RFK Jr.'s vote totals, diminishing, and the people who were disaffected Biden voters coming back home. By and large, you have the Democratic coalition pretty unified, which is why I think, and I am ideologically inclined to think this, let's be clear, that Josh Shapiro is actually a risky choice because of his comments. He compared pro-Palestine protesters to the KKK. This is obviously an issue that has been very fraught within the Democratic base. And so to raise the salience of that and, for lack of a better phrase, to kill the unified and excited vibes that exist right now, to me, that's a risk. You also have unions not excited about him because he's super pro-charter school. You have an issue with him, allegations that he covered up sexual harassment in his office. And also a personal irritation, which is that he sounds like dollar store Obama. So, however, Inez, it looks, the tea leaves are looking very much in the direction of Josh Shapiro. In addition to the fact there were some new indications this morning she's picking a governor. She had said previously, according to reports, that she was looking for someone with quote unquote executive experience. In addition, we just got the list of the battleground stops that she's making next week after she announces her VP pick. And the very first one is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So as a conservative, what do you make of Josh Shapiro on the ticket? Do you think he's additive, or do you think it's overstated what he can bring in terms of delivering the state of Pennsylvania?
So first of all, I'd like to agree with you from the right, Krystal, which is that I would call it New Jersey grandparent, like New Jersey Jewish grandparents meets Obama, the accent that he's putting on.
I hate it so much. I can't even tell you. There's a whole generation of Democratic politicians who were completely poisoned by the Obama cadence. Pete Buttigieg, Beto O'Rourke, Josh Shapiro, Cory Booker, the list goes on. And it is such a personal pet peeve. It's so irritating to me.
Yeah, I agree. And it is that very recognizable cadence. And even some of the phrases, it is very noticeable. In terms of the ticket and balancing the ticket, there's in some way the Democratic Party, I think, has some of the similar issues because of the swing states that exist, which, let's remind everybody, when we had discussions about the Electoral College many years ago, was, we're always going to be talking about Florida and Ohio. Well, no, we're not. We're talking about, just a decade later, we're talking about a totally different crop of states. And the fact that those states are very different. You have a Sun Belt group of those states, right? Of those swing states plus Georgia. And then you have the Rust Belt states. And those states have very different geographical interests. They have different economic interests. So I think it's really interesting if the principle on the ticket doesn't have a strong appeal in one or the other region, it's very difficult for the other person to balance it because you kind of have to pick. And those between the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt, and like I said, they have different economic interests. They have their different cultural interests in many ways. So I think that's probably a dynamic that will continue in both parties for quite some time. That being said, I don't know. Maybe I'm just not, up on the horse race enough, but I sort of doubt that vice presidential picks make as much difference as people seem to think that they do in elections. I think the principles are much more important. The people running for president are much more important to people's votes. I actually think they make they have a higher importance after the election. So I no longer agree with John Adams that the vice presidency is a useless endeavor, especially because Congress is so sclerotic, can do so little. If you have an active vice president with an active agenda in the executive branch, they can do a lot. They can shape the agenda a lot. And the other thing, at least on the Republican side, is to signal the future of the party, right? And so J.D. Vance, I think, is very clear pick on both of those post-election metrics, whereas I think you're right to say that the Democratic Party will not get a signal to its base that if Josh Shapiro is picked, that it's going in the direction that its base wants to. So I actually think those things are probably more important in a vice presidential pick than how they're going to balance the ticket or the states, or I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that stuff is overblown. I don't think people care nearly as much about who the vice presidential pick is as I guess political commentators do.
I actually do. Go ahead, Rachel.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that, Inez, you're correct in I think that the frames for the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign are slightly different on the vice presidential pick, because I do think for the most part, the Vance pick on the right is signaling where the direction of the party is going. But I think Kamala Harris has a different set of challenges when she's picking her VP, which is that she needs a validator, right? She is hindered, I think, from where I sit, from a host of progressive baggage. She has said things that will not resonate, to your point, in the Rust Belt. She, I think is going to have a hard time speaking to the moderate wing of the Democratic Party. I think she needs a VP that can speak on her behalf. I think there's also the fact that she has a hard time maybe articulating coherent thoughts in certain scenarios. I think this might be one of them, to put it gently. And so I do think it actually matters who she picks, because she needs a validator. She needs someone who can speak for her to certain groups. And so I think the selection frame is slightly different on the right and the left.
I think some of that is fair. I actually do think the VP pick matters. And obviously, the principle matters more. Like, obviously, people are primarily voting for the president. But, if you look back at Trump's pick of Vance, I think that was important for him, because at that point, there was still evangelical skepticism of him. And between the Vance pick and then putting out the list of the Supreme Court picks, that kind of like solidified him with a group of voters that were a little bit shaky. I also think a vice presidential pick can do harm. I think Sarah Palin did end up being harmful to John McCain, and showed, when he was supposed to be like the adult in the room and the, serious statesman, et cetera, the fact that she didn't fit with that image and became a campaign liability and the subject of endless media stories, the coverage, et cetera, I think that was a problem for him. I think Joe Biden, to your point, Rachel, about being sort of like, a validator or someone who was like a more comfortable pick for certain segments of society, I think Joe Biden served that role well for Barack Obama. He knew foreign policy, been in the Senate forever. He's just like comes off as this sort of like, middle of the road, moderate white dude. And that's kind of similar framework that the Harris people are looking at now. I mean, there's a reason everyone's been joking about, the quest for the perfect like white guy to be on the ticket, to provide that level of comfort. And also with regard to the quote unquote vibes, because unfortunately that is so much of what our politics are about, much to the chagrin of, I think, everybody on this panel. A white dude from the Midwest, whether it's Tim Walz, who has a very progressive record, or Andy Beshear, who has actually pretty good on labor and other issues, but more moderate in other regards, or whether it's Josh Shapiro, like they all come off as this just sort of mainstream pick, because it's the vibes and it's what we're used to seeing in America. And it's also like the way that they communicate. Tim Walz, even though he does have this pretty impressive, from my perspective, progressive record, he still comes off as that like high school teacher, veteran, Minnesota
high school
guy,
art teacher,
very relatable dude, even, in spite of that record. And I think is very good at messaging that record to people who might be on the fence about a Kamala Harris ticket.
Before we move on.
Wait, can I
Yeah.
not even push back so much as just narrow what I'm saying? I think a better way of saying what I tried to say earlier is that I think it matters more for intra-party dynamics than for swing voters. I have a hard time, for example, imagining the person who is comfortable with the things that Trump says and does, and is not comfortable with the things that J.D. Vance says and does. I actually think that person probably only exists in the Beltway, where people have much more specific views, both about policy and like about, sort of, I guess, even vibes indicate what ideological camp you're in. So I see it much more. I agree with you that, and the specific example of Sarah Palin, I would say the opposite. In the beginning, Sarah Palin is the only thing that made the Republican Party excited, I think, about the McCain ticket. I just think the more our politics become national, the more divided the country is, the more these kinds of regional politics fade out when it comes to the vice presidential pick. And it's a very traditional thing. Like actually, in the 19th century in America, it mattered enormously how to geographically balance the ticket. I just tend to think that our politics are moving away from that. And I think there are probably some things to lament about the fact that our politics is moving away from that. But at the end of the day, I think the best thing probably a VP pick can do is probably solidify and excite the party to the extent that the party is not excited about the main nominee. In terms of the election, like I said, I think VPs are very important for the future trajectory of a party, and then what happens if that party is actually elected to office in Washington, I think much more important than it used to be. It used to be that most useless office ever devised by man, right? But I think that's much less true now. But in terms of the election, I think it's probably more important intra-party and what you're saying to the people who are either going to be excited to turn out for you or not excited to turn out, maybe do something else that day on election day. I think that's probably more where VP picks make a difference.
So before we move on, I just want to, I'm going to go out of order here, control room. I just want to put E5 up on the screen. This is Kamala Harris, a report that says Kamala Harris is going through portfolios, basically, of different binders full of men. Maybe this is the right way to put it. Ron said binders full of women. Yeah, now Kamala Harris is sifting through binders full of white dudes to look for who she could pick. Now, she's expected to make that decision by early August, so very, very soon. Now we go to E4. We've mentioned Andy Beshear a couple of times, and he's been exchanging sort of romantic tweets, ex-posts with his wife, maybe suggesting something big is on the horizon. We don't know. Could mean anything. Could just be normal back and forth. But I think Krystal and Rachel could have maybe an interesting exchange on whether Beshear, A, is a viable vice presidential candidate, but B, I think maybe is viable as the future of the Democratic Party, where we just left off in this conversation. So I know you guys disagree on this. I'll toss it to Rachel first. You can flesh out a little bit of what you said earlier. He has made some interesting decisions on stuff beyond, just sort of traditional Democratic Party left stances on labor and all of that. He's one of the more interesting figures. I would say him and Waltz are interesting in the context of like realignment politics. So what do you make of Beshear, Rachel?
Well, I think he's any governor who survives in a state that routinely sends Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell to the Senate, I think is interesting. You're building and he's built a sustainable coalition. Now he's also, his father was a governor. He's trending a little bit on, family dynamics in that sense. That dynastic stuff always matters, I think, in state politics to a great degree. When you think about him vaulting to the national ticket, if we talk about vibes in our politics, my objection to him at that stage is purely aesthetic, because I just think that he and JD Vance trying to out hillbilly each other is going to be insufferable. And I think, you're already kind of seeing that. That's why I brought up that comment where he was talking about JD Vance saying, well, you ain't from here. I think it's literally going to be like the war of Appalachia on the vice presidential ticket. And, that is a vibe, right? And we could be here for it, but I also think it would just be insufferable.
I'm here for the war of Appalachia. See, Andy Beshear is actually a fascinating character to me because I knew him a little bit when I lived in Kentucky. His vibe is very much like minivan dad, really, truly. That's how he comes off. And I think that has served him in terms of his political persona. He is not a particularly charismatic figure. He's sort of the anti-cult of personality. And, the context in which he gets elected initially in Kentucky is, listen, the fact he's a Beshear, no doubt it makes a big difference. In Kentucky in particular, these things matter, these historic names, since it's a state that was Democratic and has trended to the right. The Democrats who have that historic connection, it helps a lot. But it also was on the back of the teachers' strike wave. And the previous governor, Matt Bevin, who was himself this sort of Trumpian businessman out of nowhere kind of a figure, he had gone after teacher pensions. It had created a massive, cross-partisan backlash across the entire state. And so Andy comes in on that promise. A part of why he's been so popular, he's the most popular Democratic governor in the entire country, which I think is astonishing, is because he's really delivered the goods. There's been a huge amount of job creation in the state of Kentucky. He's attracted a number of large-scale battery, EV battery plants to the state, which from a Democratic perspective, too, you're you delivered the jobs. They're union jobs and they're green energy jobs. So that's part of why he's been so incredibly popular there. So listen, I obviously think he could be additive to a ticket just from the sense of he's proven that he can speak to people who may otherwise be skeptical of a Democratic Party. He's had his eye on the ball in terms of, some of the populist instincts of Kentucky as a state. Kentucky's not just a hard right conservative state. It's a little more politically interesting than that. So, I think he'd be a decent pick. Electorally, I understand the appeal of Shapiro because of Pennsylvania and because he won there by freaking 16 points. I just think to Inez's point about keeping the positive vibes and the excitement in the Democratic Party, he could be a problem there. And to me, the ideal candidate is Tim Walz, who is such an effective messenger. This will be a good transition to the J.D. Vance and the weird conversation, all of that. Like, he came up with this tagline that has now rapidly been embraced by everyone in Democratic circles, used over and over and over again. And you guys may disagree, but I actually think it is an effective tag in the same way that some of Trump's tags and nicknames like Crooked Hillary, et cetera, were kind of devastating and effective. So to me, that proves his bona fides, not only in terms of the record that I like as governor of Minnesota, but in terms of how he's able to communicate about that message and frame the opposition.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.